Okay, so thank you very much for having me here today, and thank you to the organizers for putting up this great event and for adapting so well to this new virtual online format. Working great. So today, this paper that I'm presenting, it deals with the question of how fear might change our perception of objects in the world. So to start our discussion, let's see what happens, say, when a threatening object suddenly appears in the scene. So first of all, there is the bodily phenomenology of fear itself. So we might feel, for instance, our heart beating faster, our breathing strained, our eyes widening, our body adopting a defensive posture, and so on. But no, we should say these feelings are not detachable from our experience of the object itself. Rather, the object is experienced as threatening, as inextricably involved in these bodily feelings. And of course, no part of what it is for an object to be experienced as threatening in this manner is that, in a certain sense, the object itself is part of the fear episode. Now, as many philosophers have already pointed out, there is an irreducible element of intentionality in an emotion like fear. So we are afraid of the poisonous snake in front of us. When we are afraid of something, we do not experience just a set of free-floating bodily changes. We experience a set of bodily changes as directed at the fear object. So this is one way in which fear changes our conscious experience of fear objects. The fear object is experienced as threatening in this manner. But besides being experienced as threatening, it has also been claimed by psychologists that fear distorts our perceptions of certain spatial properties of objects, making us perceive objects as taller, as longer, as wider than they actually are. There are some clinical reports by Hackman and Cook who describe a highly phobic patient who claimed that whenever he approached bridges, the bridge was perceived as much longer and taller than he knew them to be. And there's another patient who also describes that during fear episodes, the windows at high levels of buildings are perceived as larger and wider than he knew them to be. So what should we ask is, should we take this report at face value? Can fear actually distort our perceptions of the world in this manner? So according to a new Gibsonian theory of embodied perception developed by psychologist Dennis Prophet, fear biases our perceptions of the world so as to favor certain kinds of action. So when you are afraid, for example, a snake may be perceived as closer than he actually is in order to help us flee. So we start the fleeing behavior earlier than we would have in normal conditions. So Chas Firestone in 2013, he mounted some serious criticism against this view, what he called a paternalistic view of perception, which conceives the visual system as quote, a teller of well-intentioned lies about the world, so as to bias perceivers towards favorable action. In its place, Firestone proposes that these empirical data that they appeal to can be fully explained by cognitive biases that operate on perfectly accurate representations of the world. So if this is correct, it would mean that fear does not distort how objects are perceived, although it may lead us to believe this is the case. So in this paper, in this presentation, I will argue that perceptual distortions might indeed be part of fearful objects seen, but not in the way that these new Gibsonians suppose. I will present here evidence that fear-related processes modulate perceptual processes which may lead to perceptual distortions. However, I want to say that these distortions are not meaningfully related to the action to be performed, as new Gibsonians claim. So this is what I'm going to do today. In the next section, I'll present the empirical evidence that has been produced in favor of the perceptual bias view defended by new Gibsonians. And then I'll discuss Firestone's alternative positive proposal to explain this in terms of cognitive biases. I will agree with Firestone that perception is not paternalistic and that cognitive bias are at work in these cases. But I'll argue there is another way of investigating perceptual distortions that is not vulnerable to the same objections. So in order to do so, I will explore Joseph Ledoux's notion of defensive organismic states, which show how defense circuits automatically release neuromodulators that induce a state of arousal in the brain and body. So these neuromodulators, they modulate perceptual processes that may lead to perceptual distortions. I will then finally, in the final conclusion, make some remarks about the usefulness of the notion of defensive organismic states for understanding the intentionality of fear and the phenomenal integration of interoceptive and exteroceptive elements in a fear episode. So the first evidence comes from a study by Teichmann and colleagues in 2011, who found that individuals who were independently assessed for high fear of heights, they consistently overestimate the vertical extent from a two-story balcony to the ground. So the results are achieved via a size estimation test, as you can see in the figure on the left, in which subjects are asked to estimate the size of a disc on the ground as they are looking at it. So as predicted, the subjects in the high fear group, they consistently underestimated this diameter, which is taking as evidence that the ground is perceived as further away than it actually is. Another study is by Stefanucci and colleagues in 2008. So in this study, the subjects are asked to stand on a skateboard on the top of a hill and then asked to estimate the inclination of the hill with a visual disc, as you see on the left. So you have to adjust the disc according to how steep you think the hill is. And after the estimation test, the subjects are then assessed for the state of fear as they were standing on the skateboard. So as predicted, self-reports of fear were also significantly correlated with overestimation of inclination relative to a low fear control group. A third study is by Cole and colleagues in 2013, where subjects were brought to a room containing a live tarantula and then asked to estimate how many inches separate them from the spider as they are looking at it. At the same time, they're also asked to produce a self-report indicating how they felt about the spider at that time. So they found that subjects' self-reported levels of fear were inversely correlated with distant estimations to the tarantula. So the more fear you feel, the closer you people say the spider is. So in order to explain these results, the authors appealed to Dennis Proffitt's new Gibsonian theory of embodied perception, according to which we perceive not only opportunities for action, but also the costs and the risks associated or involving carrying out this action. And that there is some adaptive value in perceiving the costs and risks of actions in this manner. So in this theory, fear-induced perceptual biases supposedly exist in order to promote adaptive behavior. So when we are facing an immediate danger, say a poisonous snake, we need to act quickly and effectively in relation to the fear object. So the brain's prediction of how to deal with the fear object, say to run away, is incorporated into perceptual experience in the form of perceptual biases that favor certain kinds of actions. So the hill might look steeper in order to discourage a risky descent. The ground will look further away in order to promote avoidance behavior. And the spider or the snake looks closer than it is in order to prompt immediate escape. So Firestone has mounted a series of objections against this view, which in the paper I discussed them in more detail, along with some possible replies on the part of New Gibsonians. But as we have here only a limited amount of time, I'll just skip these objections and move directly to Firestone's positive proposal, that we can fully explain these results in terms of cognitive biases that operate on accurate perceptions of the world. So Firestone, in this paper in 2013, he mentions three cognitive biases. The first is a belief on the part of subjects about the purpose of the experiment. So for example, as subjects are led to a room with a tarantula and then asked, how many inches separate them from the spider, they may reasonably suspect that there must be a relation between these two things. That is, that the fear should affect distance estimates. As such, they may more or less unconsciously adjust their responses in order to match the experiment's purpose and expectations. This is a very well-known effect that psychologists are always trying to avoid by trying to conceal the experiment's purpose. The second one it concerns the possibility that the observed bias reflects judgments rather than perceptions. So for example, upon feeling terrified of the spider in the room, subjects could have concluded that the spider must be very close when they were asked about it. So this argument draws on the fact that when we make judgments about the world, we often take into account not only what we perceive, but also how we feel about the world in order to reach certain conclusions. And psychologists are well aware of this effect. And there is, in fact, a very fruitful research program built around it, which is called the effect as information hypothesis. So as these kinds of biases on judgments are a pervasive and well-known and well-studied phenomenon, perhaps it's more parsimonious to explain the empirical data in these terms rather than appeal to some perceptual biases for which we have no independent evidence for. And the third cognitive biases concern the possibility that these biases reflect our impressions of the world as it impacts our bodies in various ways when we are actively engaged with it, rather than how the world literally appears. So we accept as perfectly fine and coherent statements like, well, I can see perfectly well that this hill is not very high, but when I'm climbing it, it feels twice as high. Now, these statements, according to Firestone, they bring out the difference between our perceptions and our cognitively changed impressions of the world. And these impressions for Firestone are not just bodily adjustments and feelings experienced in action, but reflective ways of making sense of these adjustments and feelings. So we have this implicit knowledge that this is distinct from our perceptions. We know how it looks, but we feel it to be different as we act on it. So what can we say about these cognitive biases? Well, I agree that there are important methodological limitations to the study of perceptual biases using these sorts of behavioral tests. Because, well, so far, the best way to probe into what someone perceptually experiences is by, well, you can ask someone what they're seeing, or you can let them indicate it, such as in the visual matching test. But both of these methods engage cognition. You have to make a verbal report or compare one thing with another. And when you do, you open the door for this kind of cognitive biases to intervene. So it's practically impossible to say that cognitive biases are not present, and most likely they are present in these studies. But I would like to argue that fear might be responsible for perceptual distortions, but not in the way that the New Gibsonians suppose. So in the next section, I will offer an independent way of assessing perceptual distortions that avoids these problems and that doesn't require to eliminate the possibility of cognitive biases. And this brings us to defensive organismic state. So this is a notion that I borrowed from Joseph Ledoux. And when the basic idea is that when an organism faces a threat in its environment, it activates a set of hardwired behavioral and autonomic responses that help prepare the body to deal with the threat in an effective way. So Ledoux called the circuits responsible for detecting and responding to threats defense circuits. So when a threat is detected and a defense circuit activated, a series of changes takes place within the organism. And as a result, it's an orchestrated response. As a result, the organism is aroused, it is fully focused on a threatening situation and ready to act. This is what Ledoux calls a defensive organismic state. Is it a global state, an orchestrated response that helps the organism deal effectively with the threat? But I said one of these effects is that the organism is aroused. But there is an unintended side effect of arousal. There is evidence that these neuromodulators responsible for inducing arousal in the brain and body, they affect perceptual and attentional processes, which may lead to distortions in how certain properties of objects are perceived. The first effect that I mentioned here involves modulation of the temporal properties of sensory neuron responses by norepinephrine and serotonin, which are chemicals that are automatically released in defensive organismic states that's called arousal. This is highly relevant for this kind of spatial distortions that appear in these studies because there is independent evidence from Panzeri and colleagues that spike timing is involved in the neuronal coding of the spatial structure of the environment, playing an important role in the representation of spatial properties like location and movement. So you might have some distortion here in the way these properties are represented and experienced. And a complementary effect of arousal-inducing chemicals is on attention. Several studies show that increasing the level of arousal increases subjects' performance in a central fixation test, while simultaneously decreasing performance on visual cues in the periphery. This evidence reviewed by Kahneman. And Derryberry and Tucker in '94, they proposed that the mechanisms responsible for narrowing down the focus of attention during this defensive organismic state is a tonic activation system of attention by dopaminergic structures in the brain. So this state of tonic activation helps narrow down the focus of attention onto the relevant source of information, the threatening object. Further on, Derryberry and Tucker also present evidence that this tonic activation system is lateralized and favors processing in the left hemisphere, which is known to implement a mode of attention characterized by processing of local rather than global features of stimuli. So it's focused on the relation between the parts of the object rather than relation between the object and other things in the scene. So the combination of a narrowed focus of attention and processing of local features can plausibly contribute to an explanation of the distortions observed in spatial properties. So as attention is closed down onto the sphere object in this manner, there may be a loss of perspective, as insufficient attention is paid to the background and to surrounding stimuli. So both of these effects of arousal system can explain why perceptual distortions might occur in fearful object scenes. However, contrary to what New Gibsonians suppose, perceptual distortions are not meaningfully related to the particular action to be performed. So distorted perceptions of distance, for example, do not exist to help the organism escape. Rather, what I want to say is that they're just byproducts of brain and body arousal during defensive organismic state, whose main function is to put the organism in an alert and vigilant state and ready to act. So Firestone is correct in pointing out that perception is not paternalistic in this sense, but this does not mean that perceptual distortions in fear object C could not occur, and I just showed the way in which it could occur. So based on what has been said, we are in a position to give a full account of fearful object scene. So in the present proposal, to perceive a fear object is to perceive it in a state of arousal, alertness, and action readiness, with attention sharply focused on the feared object. In addition, we may also perceive some of the object's spatial properties in a distorted manner as an unintended effect of this arousal-inducing neuromodulators. But when we try to make sense of these distortions or report on these sensory magnitudes or compare one thing with another, we may describe these objects as closer or higher or more inclined than they actually are, since perception fails to supply us with very precise information about the sensory magnitude. So to conclude, finally, one advantage of adopting this view and using the notion of defensive organismic state is that it may help us illuminate important and difficult questions in the philosophy of emotion. For once, it is very difficult to explain how bodily feelings are integrated with perceptions of external objects in a way that preserves the unity of the bodily and the intentional. So this is a problem for everyone. So some proposals, for example, Prince in 2004, he mentions, say, causal chains relating bodily feelings to their external sources, or perhaps the co-occurrence of bodily feelings in perceptual representations of external objects. So Balacina and Navy in 2014, they say neither of these options is satisfactory because both elements need to be properly integrated, not just co-occurrent or causally related. But the Balacina and Navy, they also admit that it's very hard to explain how such an integrative processes could take place. So this notion of defensive organismic state could be very useful in this respect, because the states are, by definition, sensory motor integrative devices that serve specific adaptive purposes. So an episode of fear arises on the basis of this defensive organismic state. The unified character of bodily and intentional elements is already secure at the level of the underlying defensive state. It's something that already arises together. We don't have to explain how they're put together afterwards. So we do not experience certain bodily feelings, which then get combined with perceptual information, but bodily feelings arise already as part of an orchestrated response. So defensive organismic states can nicely account for how these different elements hang together and are properly integrated in a biological survival circuit. As such, it can be a valuable tool for philosophers interested in explaining the intentionality of fear and the phenomenal integration of interoceptive and exteroceptive elements in a fearful episode. So that's what I had to say. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Now we are open for questions and asking the chat. I have a quick question about so Firestone is a modularis, like he believes that perceptual systems are sensory modules, and so would you consider like that this modulation of fear that these distortions could be a product of cognitive penetrability or for example, attention is conceived in which sense? So there is no cognitive penetrability in attention, is something separated. So I have these doubts about, especially on view.
Yeah, so that's a good question. When I started my research on this paper, I started out with the goal of showing that there is affective penetration. Now, their emotions and other affective states can penetrate perception. But as I did my research and as I was writing this paper, I came to see that the relation between these affective states and the perceptual states is not a relation of penetration. It's a relation of penetration, relation between content. So now the concepts have to be meaningfully related somehow. And what is doing the penetration here is the defensive organismic state, which is a state that has no content. So it's not a cognitive state. It's just a bodily response. So it doesn't make sense to talk in terms of penetration relation. That's why I prefer now to talk of integration. So it's a state where perceptual information is integrated with bodily information, and this is a global organismic state. So it's not a case for me of cognitive penetration, but rather of integration.
Thank you. Have more questions? I have a question. So Jefferson Giello Hooferman has a question. Yes.
It's very quick. Thank you for the presentation. I was thinking more about, okay, in the relation between the perception of fearful objects. Then you explain how there is no, the neo-Gibsonians are wrong. But one interesting case that I don't know if it's easy or what I was wondering if it is easier or harder to explain is the case of things like panic attacks. A panic attack does not have a one object. It's a generalized state. So it is even difficult to account as perception because actually, so it's not really a question, it's more association. How cases like that, like panic attacks, fit in this sort of an account?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. Oh, in the paper, I start and I say like, well, here in the paper, I'm going to focus on cases of fear directed at particular objects or material objects. So it's like snakes or windows, buildings, anything can be a material object. But I'll say that I'll focus on these cases. And I grant that some episodes of fear, of anxiety, that may be no object, no material object, or even an abstract object. For example, you can fear the rise of fascism or the upcoming economic recession and so on. But I will not deal with this case. I'll just focus on what happens when we see a fear object. And I'll have nothing to say for the moment on these other cases of objectless fears, let's say.
We have another question from Sergio Farias de Souza Filho.
So thank you, Felipe, for your talk. I really enjoyed it. It's not really a question, it's more a request for you to develop a bit more how your approach is supposed to illuminate the intentionality of fears in the case of sensory perception, sensory fears. It was not quite clear to me. So if you could please develop a bit more.
Sorry, you say eliminate the intentionality?
Yeah, how your approach illuminates the intentionality of fears.
No, but maybe there was a misunderstanding. So my aim is not to eliminate, but to incorporate. No, it's an
not eliminate. Illuminate. Explain.
Illuminate.
Sorry, my mic is not so good, so maybe that's the reason.
No, well, the idea is that we have to explain how emotions can be at the same time something bodily and something directed at the world, right? That's something that everybody needs to explain. So that's why this somatic theory sometimes has trouble explaining how these things can be about the objects in the world. So Jesse Prince has a story, a telesemantic story about how this body state can come to represent certain things, that they have the function of representing certain things. So there's one way of explaining it. So in the way I'm proposing, so here in the paper, I make it clear that I'm not presupposing any particular theory of emotion. So what I presuppose is the existence of a more primitive and underlying defensive organismic state. And then there's a fear of episode that's somehow related to it. But it could be that it's just a perception of the state, or it's a cognitive interpretation of the state. It can be something, how they're two related, I leave open for the time being. But the idea is that at this more primitive level, you already find a perception of the external object and the bodily feelings integrated as part of a single orchestrated response. So it already starts out as being about something. The two things are tightly coupled and integrated.
Okay, thank you. We'll talk later. Thank you.
Sure.
We have another question from Filippo Contesi.
Hi. So I have thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. So I wonder what you would say to a skeptical view of the following sort, right? Something like that, given the state of the debate on cognitive penetration and the integration between different parts of emotional responses. The skeptical view would be, well, yeah, there are those there's those data on sensory and attention modulation that you mentioned, but that's not enough to go one way or the other, right? So one thing is, obviously Firestone is, as was mentioned before, Firestone is very critical of this idea of cognitive penetration, right? So he's likely to have a different understanding of the sensory perception divide. So he might say things like, well, yeah, sure, okay, you have this data on sensory and attention modulation, but that might not be enough to tell you anything, because the sensory data might be contrasted by adjustments in the post-sensory processing, that leads to perception. And the attention data might be post-sensory, so it might not, or even post-perceptual, so it might not even be relevant, right? And on the other hand, you might think that there may be, for all we know, there may be evolutionary reasons, so there may be ways in which the modulation of perception and fear might be evolutionary advantageous, right? So you might come up, maybe it's not as simple as the neo-Gibsonian we're thinking, right? That you've got like a bigger perception and fear because it's it's a threat. But there may be some evolutionary story to be given in that sense.
Yeah, so the first part of the question, as I was saying to Jefferson, I'm not conceiving of the relation between affective states and perceptual states in terms of a penetration relation. So maybe even, Firestone could say like, well, fear modulates attention, that's fine. That's not a cognitive penetration relation, because people don't usually, that's controversial, but many people don't consider the modulation of attention to be a case of cognitive penetration. There is the other case where the modulation of the representation of spatial properties by norepinephrine and serotonin. That you can say it's the case, but more similar to the way a machine might heat up when it's working, and then this causes some distortions in how information is processed within the machine. So that's why I say it's not meaningfully related to the action being performed. It's just a byproduct. We need arousal in order to be able to act quickly and to be able to be alert and focused on the threatening object. And one side effect, one byproduct of this is that some spatial properties might end up being distorted. But how you make sense of these distortions then it's by the cognitive biases that Firestone mentions. Then you say like, well, I'm terrified of the spider, and perception is not supplying really very precise information about what it is. So when someone asks you, well, how close do you think the spider is? Like, well, I think it's very close, because your perception doesn't supply with very precise information about it. So in my view, the evolutionary advantage story is because we need arousal in order to be able to act quickly. But there is some unintended side effects. But when you weigh the two things, it's worth having some unintended distortions or side effects, because we then, on the basis of arousal, act quickly and be alert and focused and so on.
Sophia also has a question.
Yes. Thank you very much, Felipe. I am sorry, I had some problems here and I couldn't hear all your talk, but it's very interesting topic what you are writing about. And I wonder if you are considering some theories about the physiology of fear, the chemical processes that are happening in our body during a fear process, and if you also are considering some experiments with fMRI and I don't know, maybe pictures. I don't know if you mentioned that because I couldn't hear all your talk. I'm sorry for that. But that would be my question. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thanks. And about the chemicals that are involved in the fear response. Yeah, that's precisely, that Joseph Ledoux is very good in this respect, because he has been researching fear for decades, and he has a lot of things to say on fear responses and the amygdala, how the amygdala is involved in it, and how the visual information might go directly to the amygdala while bypassing the neocortex, and this leads us to a much quicker and faster response on the basis of very coarse and rapid visual information, and the amygdala can orchestrate all the bodily responses associated with fear, even before the information reaches the neocortex. So it's very relevant for this kind of things. For this paper, I do not go into fMRI studies. I go over them in another paper that I have on emotion perception. So how do we perceive or recognize or make sense of other people's expressions of fear? There I go more into this sort of research. But so far, for this project of explaining how we see fear objects, I think the fMRI is not so directly relevant as the more biochemical stuff.
Thank you again, Felipe.
Thank you very much.